Welcome, everyone, to our fun little study group for PP 5340. That's Introduction to Public Policy and Management. Today, we're looking at the readings from the required text, Essential History for Public Administration, specifically Chapter 6. We're doing a deep dive into From Past to Present, the current era, basically exploring how government's role has transformed over the last few decades and what forces are really shaping it right now.
Exactly. And our mission for this deep dive is really to pull out the most important insights from this chapter. We want to connect that historical context, the stuff we've been talking about in previous sessions, directly to the pressing issues facing public administration today. So get ready for hopefully some genuine aha moments that'll help you cut through the noise and really understand what it means to be well-informed about public policy.
Okay, perfect. Let's unpack this. So our journey begins with a pretty pivotal shift in American attitudes towards government. This really kicks off in the late 1960s and into the 1970s.
Right, a really turbulent time.
Definitely. We saw a really significant decline in trust in the national government. I mean, think about it. Massive events like the Vietnam War and, of course, the Watergate scandal. That really shook public faith, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Watergate culminated in President Nixon's resignation in 1974, and that sent shockwaves.
Huge shockwaves. But here's an interesting counterpoint that the chapter brings up. While that national trust was, plummeting,
Yeah,
trust in state and local government often pulled surprisingly higher.
that is interesting. So people made a distinction.
It seems like it. Yeah, maybe distinguishing between the distant, sometimes scandal-ridden federal government and the more immediate, tangible impacts of local services, like your roads getting fixed or local schools.
That makes a lot of sense. And what's truly fascinating here, if we zoom out a bit, is that amidst this decline in trust, particularly at the federal level, the late 1970s and 1980s saw this really powerful resurgence.
The resurgence of what?
Of a more conservative view of government's role. This wasn't just a minor blip. It was a perspective strikingly reminiscent of attitudes before the Great Society.
Oh, okay. Like rolling things back.
Kind of. A skepticism about big government that's actually quite distinct from public attitudes in many other developed nations. And importantly, it absolutely continues to influence policy today.
So it wasn't just a temporary reaction.
No, it had lasting power.
Right.
And political historian Arthur Schlesinger, he revisited his 1986 book, The Cycles of American History, back in 1999. And he made this incredibly insightful observation. He had predicted, based on historical cycles, a political shift back from private interest to public purpose.
Okay, like the pendulum swinging back.
Exactly. But he noted that it failed to materialize in the 1990s. The swing didn't happen as expected.
Huh. Why not? Did he have any theories?
He speculated on a few potential reasons. Maybe the computer revolution, as he called it, was replacing the Industrial Revolution as a key societal driver, changing the whole dynamic. Or perhaps there was just public fatigue, Fatigue with the rapid social change of the 1960s Great Society era. People were tired.
That seems plausible. So much happened so fast back then.
Right. And he even considered the end of the Cold War. The collapse of the Soviet Union removed that common external threat that might have previously, unified the nation around larger government efforts.
Interesting. So, if I'm understanding you correctly, the crucial insight here isn't just about the 90s, but about this whole era. It suggests that unlike those big sweeping waves of federal change we saw earlier in American history, like the New Deal or the Great Society,
Yeah.
these intense federal government transformations aren't inevitable. They're not predictable cycles.
Exactly. They're more like the result of unique, kind of rare convergences of specific forces. A perfect storm, maybe.
And perhaps, as Schlesinger hinted, Americans had just reached their limit, their saturation point for, quote, sudden government-oriented social change.
Precisely. That's a really key takeaway. The core idea is that we should probably expect more incremental shifts, kind of back and forth movements between private interest and public purpose going forward.
Okay, not those giant leaps anymore.
Maybe not as often, yeah. And this often means that important innovations in public sector practices might increasingly happen at the state and local levels.
Right, where communities can experiment and adapt more readily.
Exactly. Instead of waiting for these huge national mandates. So this historical context, this whole post-Great Society landscape, is absolutely crucial for understanding the key features of this period we're calling the current era. And it helps us see how those foundational eras, the founding, progressive, New Deal, Great Society, they continue to inform our current understanding of public administration. It's not just history, it's the lens, really.
Okay, got it. That sets the stage really well. So with that backdrop, let's dive into the 1980s. You mentioned a resurgence of conservative views. How did that play out?
Well, here's where it gets really interesting, as you said earlier. The 1980s marked a truly dramatic ideological pivot in the United States.
A pivot how?
The prevailing view shifted. It went from government being seen, generally, as a potential problem solver, to government itself becoming viewed as a significant contributor to the nation's problems.
Wow, that's a big shift. Government as the problem.
A huge shift. And national political leaders during this time, they explicitly aimed to cut and trim government. They wanted to roll back its role, essentially, to what it was before the Great Society, maybe even before the New Deal in some ways.
So that impulse for broad social change that really characterized the Great Society, it had just fizzled out by then.
It had largely dissipated by the late 1970s, yeah. And the context for the shift was, well, it was ripe. You had high inflation, a relatively weak economy at the end of the 70s.
Right, stagflation and all that.
Exactly. It created a really fertile environment for a significant change in political direction. People were genuinely ready for something different.
And that something different arrived with.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the election of conservative Ronald Reagan in 1980, defeating the incumbent Jimmy Carter, powerfully captured this national mood.
Right. His message resonated.
It really did. And Reagan's skepticism of government wasn't new. It was evident way back in the early 1960s. He famously denounced an early version of Medicare as socialized medicine when he was a spokesperson for the American Medical Association.
I remember hearing about that.
But as president, he made his views undeniably clear. He explicitly stated that programs like, and I'm quoting roughly here, food stamps, the minimum wage, federal urban renewal, and the entire array of Great Society programs enacted in the 1960s had destroyed the economy and made Americans poorer.
Wow. He didn't mince words.
Not at all. For Reagan, government itself was not just inefficient, it was the problem. And this marked a profound change in the thinking about the very purpose of government. It really set the tone for the whole decade.
Okay. So this new perspective, government is the problem. How did it translate into policy? It emphasized applying market-like economic concepts from the private sector directly to the public sector.
Exactly. That was the core idea. And President Reagan found a strong ideological partner in British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher.
Ah, the Iron Lady.
Indeed. She, along with policymakers in places like Australia and New Zealand, had actually already been using economic concepts for several years to try and shrink big government.
How was he doing that?
Primarily through privatization and contracting out public services.
Okay, you mentioned those terms earlier. Let's clarify the distinction again because it's important.
Definitely. So privatization involves moving public services entirely to the private sector. For example, a city might just discontinue its own ambulance service and let one or more private companies provide it, maybe regulating them, maybe not.
Okay, completely hands-off for the government operationally.
Right. Whereas contracting out, which we often call outsourcing, means the city, in our example, retains ownership and oversight of the ambulance service.
So they're still responsible.
They're still ultimately responsible, yes, but they contract with a private or maybe a nonprofit organization to actually perform the daily operations. They run the ambulances, hire the EMTs, etc.
Got it. Privatization is selling it off. Contracting is hiring someone else to do it.
A good way to summarize it. And we saw concrete examples of privatization in Great Britain under Thatcher. The government sold off major publicly owned businesses, things like shipping ports, steel production, British Airways, British Petroleum, even the gas, water, and electric utilities. Huge sales.
Wow. Did that happen on the same scale in the U.S. under Reagan?
Not quite on that scale, no. While there were only a few truly successful federal privatization and contracting initiatives in the U.S. during Reagan's 2 terms, the intense attention given to the idea during this period was significant.
So it planted the seeds.
Exactly. It gave the concepts tremendous momentum heading into the 1990s. The seeds were definitely planted, even if the full harvest hadn't quite arrived yet at the federal level.
Okay. Besides privatization and contracting, what other economic ideas were influential in the 80s?
Another really impactful application of economic thought was the push for significant tax cuts. This approach is often referred to, sometimes critically, as trickle-down economics.
Right. I've heard that term. What's the theory behind it?
It was based heavily on an analysis by economist Arthur Laffer. The theory basically posited that taxes were so high, particularly on businesses and higher earners, that they actively discouraged investment and economic activity.
So high taxes were seen as a drag on the economy.
Precisely. The idea was that cutting these taxes would stimulate economic growth. Businesses would invest more, create more jobs, and this increased activity would ultimately generate more tax revenue for the government, offsetting the initial loss from the cuts.
The idea that tax cuts pay for themselves.
That was the hope, yes. That giving tax breaks, particularly to the wealthy and corporations, would eventually benefit everyone through increased economic activity. The wealth would trickle down.
Okay, so what was the actual outcome? Did it work as planned?
Well, the outcome was, let's say, mixed, and it's still debated today. While these tax cuts may have generated some economic growth, the economy did grow in the 80s after the initial recession.
Fine.
But they also resulted in really substantial increases in the federal deficit. That's the gap between what the government spends and what it takes in each year.
So the cuts didn't pay for themselves.
Largely, no.
Hmm.
And with the exception of a very brief period in the late 1990s when there was a surplus, this pattern of increasing federal deficits leading to a ballooning national debt has pretty much continued to the present day.
So a major long-term consequence was increased government debt.
A very significant one, yes. It challenged that initial promise of self-financing tax cuts.
Okay, so this conservative preference for shrinking government's influence, it went beyond just spending and taxes, right? What about regulation?
Absolutely. It extended to policy areas like regulation as well. For instance, we saw weakened regulation of certain financial institutions' lending practices.
And that led to...
That led directly to the infamous savings and loan crisis, or the S&L crisis.
Oh, right. That was a big deal.
A huge deal. It wasn't small potatoes. This crisis resulted in the failure of over 1,000 savings and loan institutions and ended up costing the federal government, meaning taxpayers, a staggering $132 billion to clean up.
Wow. But that's a stark reminder of the potential downsides of deregulation.
It certainly is. And environmental regulation also saw a significant shift in direction.
How so?
Well, administrators appointed to key agencies like the Department of Interior and the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. They actively sought to make more public lands available for activities like mining, oil drilling, and grazing.
So prioritizing resource extraction over conservation.
That was the emphasis, yes. They also significantly cut the EPA's budget and generally slowed down its regulatory work. The pace of issuing and enforcing regulations decreased.
Was there any pushback against that?
There was, actually. Scandals, particularly in the Department of Interior, forced the resignations of some of Reagan's initial, more aggressively anti-regulation appointees.
Okay, so some limits.
Yes, and they were often replaced by more moderate successors. So looking back, while the 1980s were certainly a challenging time for environmental regulation, the fundamental structure of the major environmental laws passed back in the 1960s and 1970s, like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, that structure largely remained intact.
So a strong push for change, but maybe not a complete dismantling.
Exactly. There was a strong push, but it met resistance, and the basic legal framework endured, though its enforcement and application were certainly affected.
Okay. So that brings us to the end of the 80s, a decade defined by government as the problem, tax cuts, deregulation attempts, and the rise of privatization concepts. What happened next? Did Clinton's election in '92 swing the pendulum decisively back towards public purpose?
You might reasonably expect that, right? A Democrat following 2 terms of Reagan. But instead, what emerged in the 1990s was actually this fascinating blend of conservative and progressive thought.
A blend? How did that work?
The focus shifted heavily towards applying those economic, business-like concepts, but now the goal was framed more around improving the public sector's cost efficiency and service delivery effectiveness. Less about just shrinking government, more about making it work better, often using private sector tools.
Okay, so not just cut, but reform using business ideas.
Exactly. And Clinton himself articulated this perspective really clearly in his 1996 State of the Union speech. He said, and this is a famous quote, "We know big government does not have all the answers. We know there's not a program for every problem. The era of big government is over."
Yes, the era of big government is over. That line really stuck.
It absolutely did. He went on to say, "But we cannot go back to the time when our citizens were left to fend for themselves." So he was advocating for a balance, finding a third way. But that first part, the era of big government is over. was the phrase that really resonated and captured the prevailing sentiment of the time.
So how did this third way, this focus on efficiency and effectiveness, manifest in practice?
Well, this era was famously characterized by the reinventing government movement. It profoundly influenced federal administration.
Reinventing government, that sounds familiar.
It was huge at the time. The Clinton administration, heavily inspired by David Osborne and Ted Gabler's 1992 bestseller, Reinventing Government, how the entrepreneurial spirit is transforming the public sector.
Right, that book was everywhere.
It really was. They created the National Performance Review, or NPR. It was later renamed the National Partnership for Reinventing Government in 1998, and it was spearheaded by Vice President Al Gore.
Okay, so what did the NPR actually do? What were its key features?
It had several core components designed to fundamentally change how government operated, not necessarily what it did. Its guiding vision was simply to create a government that works better and costs less.
Works better, costs less. Sounds appealing.
Definitely. And it was built on 4 core principles. First, putting customers first. Notice the language there.
Customers, not citizens.
Interesting.
Yes, very deliberate. Second, cutting red tape. Third, empowering employees on the front lines. And fourth, cutting back to basics, focusing on core functions.
Okay, those sound like business principles almost.
Very much so. Strategically, the NPR focused on actions that could be taken administratively by the executive branch, deliberately avoiding the need for new legislation whenever possible to streamline the reform process.
So change from within rather than fighting through Congress? Largely, yes. It meant changing how agencies operated rather than attempting these big, disruptive, wholesale reorganizations that often fail. And importantly, the program intentionally avoided the really volatile political questions about what government should be doing.
Sidestepping the big ideological battles.
Exactly. Concentrating instead purely on how it worked. It fundamentally shifted accountability, moving away from just controlling inputs, like agency budget.
Right, the traditional focus.
To actually measuring results. What outcomes are we achieving? That was a big shift. Authority was pushed down to the front line whenever possible, empowering those directly delivering services.
Giving them more discretion.
Yes. The initiative also aimed to end the use of internal monopolies within government situations where one part of government had to buy services from another part. It encouraged competition.
Like letting agencies choose their own IT provider, perhaps.
Potentially, yeah. Allowing for greater competition in service provision. And there was a comprehensive review of federal regulations with the explicit purpose of eliminating unnecessary ones and revising others that were outdated or overly burdensome. And finally, it established formal goal-setting processes, performance tracking systems, and customer service standards for pretty much every federal organization.
Wow. That's a really comprehensive list of changes. It sounds like a serious effort. Did it actually achieve tangible results, or was it mostly just talk?
Oh no, the NPR wasn't just talk. It achieved some really impressive, tangible results that significantly reshaped the federal workforce and its operations. Elaine Kimmark, who was the first director of the initiative, she listed some key achievements. The federal workforce, for instance, was reduced by a staggering 426,200 positions between 1993 and 2000.
400,000, that's huge.
It made the federal government, in terms of personnel size, as small as it had been since the Eisenhower years back in the 1950s.
Incredible. What else?
Regulatory changes alone were estimated to yield substantial savings of $136 billion. They cut overstaffed headquarters and layers of management, eliminating 78,000 management positions.
Trimming the bureaucracy.
Yes, and they eliminated 640,000 pages of internal agency rules. Think about that volume. Over 2,000 field offices were closed, and 250 programs and agencies were entirely eliminated.
Wow, real cuts.
Real cuts. And even procurement system reform, how the government buys things that alone was estimated to save $250 million per year just in processing costs.
Those are some big numbers.
Yeah.
But did the impact last beyond the Clinton years?
That's what's really remarkable. Its influence continued well beyond the administration that created it. Kmark noted that the subsequent administration, George W. Bush's, actually expanded the use of performance measures pioneered by NPR. And some administrative practices initiated by NPR were even formalized into law, put into statute during the administration of Barack Obama in 2010.
So it had real staying power. Beyond the numbers and the specific initiatives, what was the single biggest shift in thinking that this reinventing government movement cemented that still influences us today?
I think the crucial takeaway, the underlying philosophy that really permeated everything was this idea of running government like a business. That phrase became a kind of universal descriptor for the belief that improving public sector efficiency and effectiveness required adopting more business-like approaches.
Even though government isn't exactly a business.
Right. And it's important to note the original authors of the Reinventing Government book, Osborne and Gabler, they did acknowledge the fundamental differences between government and the private sector. They emphasized that market-like techniques had to be carefully tailored. But, in the public imagination and often in practice, the idea of just importing private sector methods wholesale really took hold.
And you mentioned earlier that this push was grounded in specific economic theories.
Yes, absolutely. This wasn't just a vague idea. It drew on specific economic theories used to analyze and assess government operations. First, there's public choice theory. Put simply, this applies economic concepts to public sector behavior, often operating on the assumption that politicians and bureaucrats, like people in markets, will tend to act in their own individual economic or political self-interest.
Okay, like maximizing their budget or power.
Or getting reelected, yeah. Second, we have principal agent theory. This focuses on the challenges of designing incentives to get employees, the agents, to take actions that are consistent with the preferences of their employers or the principals.
How do you make sure the agent does what the principal wants?
Exactly. It's a classic problem. And finally, transaction cost theory. This is used to evaluate all the economic costs involved when government contracts with outside organizations to deliver public services. It looks beyond just the contract price to include the costs of finding providers, negotiating, monitoring performance, enforcing the contract, etc., all the friction.
Okay, so these economic theories provided a kind of intellectual framework for the run government like a business idea.
They did. They gave it analytical heft.
Now, at the state and local government levels, did this same impulse appear?
Yes, very much so, but it often took the form of what became known as New Public Management, or NPM.
New public management. Okay, how is that different from reinventing government?
NPM wasn't really a rigid, tightly defined list of techniques. It was more like a toolkit, a set of related concepts that were adapted and implemented differently across various organizations and countries, actually. It was an international trend.
So more flexible. What were some common features?
Common features definitely included viewing citizens primarily as customers of public services, that language again, and viewing administrators not just as bureaucrats, but as innovative managers, actively seeking new and cost-efficient ways to deliver those services. Think entrepreneurs within government. It strongly emphasized formal systems for measuring outcomes. Performance management became huge, and it promoted contracting out public services to nonprofit and private organizations as a key cost-saving and efficiency-driving measure.
Okay, so similar themes to reinventing government, but maybe applied more broadly and flexibly at state and local levels. But you hinted earlier that NPM faced some critiques.
Oh, absolutely. It faced several significant critiques, particularly concerning that inherent distinction between private sector management and public governance. And this really raises an important question for you, the listener, to think about. What do you expect from democratic governance when it adopts a customer service model?
Yeah, what are the implications?
Well, think about the fundamental difference. A private business usually operates in a competitive environment. It's often secretive about its strategies. And crucially, customers can typically choose among multiple providers. If you don't like one airline, you fly another.
Right. Choice is key.
But government, in many areas, is typically a monopoly. Think police services or the court system. And it has the unique coercive power to levy taxes. This coercive power carries with it an intrinsic expectation of democratic participation in policymaking, even if that participation is just limited to voting for elected leaders.
So we expect to say because we're forced to pay.
In a way, yes. Also, interactions between private companies and their customers are generally voluntary on both sides. You choose to buy from them, they choose to sell to you, but interactions between public agencies and their clientele often are not voluntary. Think about paying taxes or dealing with the justice system or getting required permits.
You don't really have a choice there.
Exactly. And customers generally have little or no direct influence over the leadership or strategy of a private business. You can complain, but you don't elect the CEO. Whereas citizens, in theory at least, elect public sector leaders and can provide input on policy issues through various channels. Critically, NPM's market model, with its focus on the customer, emphasizes a view of the public as recipients of services customers to be served, rather than as citizens actively involved in governing.
So it potentially sidelines the citizen role.
Yeah.
The idea of citizens as the ultimate owners of the government who determine its direction.
Precisely. It risks overlooking that core democratic concept, which traces all the way back to the American Revolution.
So the core insight here, the critique, is that while NPM might be really effective for improving efficiency in routine transactional tasks, like, say, handling automobile registrations or answering utility bill inquiries,
The day-to-day stuff.
efficiency isn't always the best or only guide for deciding the big macro-level issues, like what services should government provide in the first place, or how should they be delivered fundamentally.
Exactly. At that higher level, we're talking about citizens deciding the future of their community. Customers, on the other hand, are typically involved only after those big decisions have already been made by the business.
Okay, so where does that leave us now? Has NPM just disappeared?
Well, looking towards the present, it seems NPM has somewhat faded as the dominant paradigm for public sector reform in the 21st century. It's still influential, but maybe not the only game in town.
Why the shift away?
I think administrators and scholars increasingly recognize that government encompasses far more than just economic efficiency. There are other values at play: equity, justice, democratic participation. So contemporary thought has broadened to what is often identified as new public governance, or NPG.
New public governance. Okay, how is NPG different from NPM?
NPG is generally seen as a looser, more encompassing paradigm. It definitely incorporates NPM's focus on outcomes, performance measurement, and good customer service. These things haven't gone away. But it also explicitly integrates several other crucial elements,
Like what?
like networks of coordination between government agencies, and also across different layers of government: federal, state, local, breaking down silos. It emphasizes cooperation with private and nonprofit organizations, think public-private partnerships, but maybe in a more collaborative, less purely contractual way. It brings back a strong emphasis on the active participation of citizens in both policymaking and implementation. And critically, it recognizes the central role of values, things like equity, fairness, sustainability in influencing decision-making alongside efficiency.
So it's more holistic, networked, value-driven, and citizen-centric view compared to the more market-driven NPM.
That's a great way to put it. Yes, much more holistic and community-focused. It acknowledges the complexity of governing in the 21st century.
Okay, that transition to MPG seems like a good bridge to the next section. The 2000s brought a whole new set of challenges, didn't they? Starting with a really defining event.
Yeah, absolutely. The early 21st century, dramatically ushered in by the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, brought truly significant changes to the political and social environment of public administration. And while it's always difficult, maybe impossible, to draw firm conclusions about conditions that are still unfolding around us.
Right, history is still being written.
Exactly. But we can identify several crucial trends from the 2000s onwards that are clearly shaping the theory and practice in our field today.
Okay, what are some of the biggest ones?
Well, these trends represent pretty profound societal shifts, each presenting unique challenges, but also maybe opportunities for public administration. Let's delve into some of the most impactful, starting with something that affects literally everyone: technology.
Ah, yes. Technology everywhere. It's hard to even imagine life without it now.
Isn't it? Imagine a world not tightly connected by electronically controlled systems, devices, programs. It's almost inconceivable today. Our daily operations, from critical infrastructure like water and sewer systems, the power grid, to hospitals, airlines, they all depend on this pervasive technology.
And it's amazing how new this phenomenon really is, historically speaking.
It's incredibly recent. Personal computers and printers only really started replacing typewriters in offices in the 1980s. Email and electronic file transfer became common in the 1990s. The internet became that all-encompassing information source only around the turn of the century. The iPhone wasn't introduced until 2007, and Android followed around 2010.
Just over a decade ago for smartphones to become ubiquitous.
Exactly. And now we worry about Constant screen usage, the dangers of texting while driving, the negative impacts of social media on mental health and public discourse. It's been a rapid, seismic shift with huge societal consequences.
So how has this technological revolution specifically impacted government and public administration?
Well, this global connectivity, largely driven by the ever-present mobile phone in nearly everyone's pocket, has fundamentally reshaped society and our interactions in really profound ways. For one, it's completely changed how social movements and political campaigns organize and disseminate information. Think Arab Spring, or how campaigns use micro-targeting.
Instant global networks.
Right. And the publicness, you could call it, of government officials' behavior, particularly visible officials like police officers, has dramatically increased. Everyday events, interactions, even misconduct can now be instantly recorded and shared globally for anyone to see.
Yeah, the cell phone camera effect.
Definitely. And significantly for public administration, much of the documentation and work product of governments at all levels, things like local agency budgets, tax assessments, planning studies, meeting minutes, it's now readily available online, often required by law. This represents a dramatic shift in organizational transparency and official practices in a very, very short period of time. We've gone from paper files in dusty archives to instant digital access.
Which raises some big questions, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Here's a provocative question for you, the listener, to ponder. How does this unprecedented transparency and instant access to information alter your expectations of government? And what new challenges does it pose for public agencies trying to maintain data security and individual privacy in an age of constant cyber threats?
That's a lot to chew on. Security and privacy versus transparency. A constant tension.
A huge one.
And yet, amidst all this technological connection and information flow, you mentioned another trend from the 2000s onward. A feeling of insecurity and violence, which seems paradoxical, right? Because overall crime rates statistically are relatively low compared to past decades, and there's no major existential military threat to the U.S.
It is a paradox, but that feeling of fear, of vulnerability to attack, is undeniably real for many citizens, even if the statistics paint a different picture overall.
What's driving that fear, according to the chapter?
Well, it's been significantly shaped by a number of horrific, high-profile mass casualty attacks within the United States. These stick in the public consciousness. Beyond 9/11, which was obviously seminal, think about the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City back in April 1995. Timothy McVeigh, an Army veteran protesting federal policy, killed 168 people, including 19 children in a daycare center.
Just horrific.
Unimaginable. And other fatal attacks in schools and public places have also left this lasting scar on the national psyche. Virginia Tech University in 2007, 32 killed. Sandy Hook Elementary School in 2012, 20 young children and 6 staff members murdered. The Boston Marathon bombing in 2013. The Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando in 2016, 49 killed. The Las Vegas Music Festival shooting in 2017, 58 killed. These events create a sense of random vulnerability.
And attacks abroad probably contribute to the feeling, too.
Yes. High-profile attacks in Europe, often linked to terrorist organizations in the Middle East, have definitely further contributed to a sense of fear in the United States, even though the direct threat profile might be different.
How is it different?
Well, it's worth noting an important distinction the chapter makes. With major exceptions like 9/11, most mass casualty attacks in the U.S. have been carried out either by individuals with purely domestic grievances, like McVeigh, or by people professing radical religious beliefs but without direct operational connections to foreign organizations. The sort of coordinated terrorist attacks directly orchestrated by foreign groups, as seen more frequently in Europe during certain periods, haven't become as common on U.S. soil.
Okay, that's an important nuance. But the feeling of insecurity persists regardless.
It does. Even with that distinction, it's difficult for many people to escape the sense that a new era of disorder and random violence has begun, and this presents a clear challenge to public sector intelligence and law enforcement agencies. Security and terrorism studies have emerged as rapidly growing fields of academic study and professional practice within public administration.
And politically.
Unsurprisingly, in the political arena, fear of violence, often fear of violence by outsiders, is frequently used as a tool to gain electoral support. And this rhetoric can, in turn, influence citizens' expectations of what public safety agencies should be doing, how aggressive they should be.
Okay, so technology and insecurity are two big trends.
Yeah.
What else characterized the 2000s onwards?
Environmental concerns remained a major constant battleground.
Right, you mentioned the back and forth earlier. Regulations protecting air, water, endangered species, sensitive lands.
Yeah.
Always contested.
Always. And saying it's a battleground, while true, really obscures the immense complexity of these issues. We're talking about incredibly intricate legislative actions, really complex agency rulemaking processes involving scientific data and economic analysis, numerous court challenges going up to the Supreme Court,
A lawyer's paradise.
chuckles, perhaps, and vigorous advocacy, lobbying, public relations campaigns from both industry groups and environmental activist organizations constantly clashing.
So what are the broad battle lines?
Broadly speaking, commercial and industrial interests consistently seek to weaken environmental controls. They want easier access to public lands for resource extraction mining, oil and gas drilling, logging, grazing. They often argue regulations stifle economic growth. Conversely, environmental interests work tirelessly to protect air and water quality, preserve biodiversity, combat climate change, and restrict the commercial exploitation of public lands. They argue for long-term sustainability.
And you mentioned the policy shifts across administrations continued after the 90s.
Oh, yes, the pendulum kept swinging. During the George W. Bush administration in the 2000s, for instance, similar to the Reagan years, there was a renewed emphasis on selling federal lands, opening more federal lands and offshore waters to drilling and extraction, and rolling back some air and water quality regulations implemented under Clinton.
Okay, then Obama.
The Obama administration, from 2008 to 2016, generally moved in the opposite direction. The focus shifted back to strengthening environmental regulations, heavily encouraging the development and use of renewable energy sources like solar and wind, and taking significant actions, both domestically and internationally, to address climate change impacts.
And since then?
Since then, the approach of the national government has largely shifted back again towards deregulation and prioritizing private economic interests, particularly in the energy sector.
So a real seesaw at the federal level.
Yeah.
But what about state and local action? You highlighted Oregon's land use planning earlier. Did that trend continue?
Yes, and that's a crucial point. While some environmental issues, like climate change or interstate air pollution, are undeniably national or even global in scope, many significant environmental initiatives continue to happen at the community or state levels. These local efforts often step into the breach when federal action is stalled or reversed.
You give us an example?
Sure. If the federal government is politically unwilling or unable to take strong action on climate change, you see many cities and states setting their own ambitious renewable energy goals or adopting stricter emissions standards for vehicles, sometimes exceeding federal requirements. And many initiatives are very localized and community-focused. Remember Seattle's Pea Patch Community Gardens program? It manages 88 gardens across the city.
Right, growing food, building community.
Exactly. Residents grow their own produce, which fosters community connections, but they also donate thousands of pounds of fresh food to local food banks annually. It's a great example of local government facilitating grassroots environmental and social action. In 2014 alone, they donated over 41,000 pounds of produce.
That's impressive. And the Oregon example?
Oregon's statewide land use planning program, adopted way back in 1973, remains groundbreaking. It mandates every city, county, and special purpose service district to prepare a comprehensive growth plan. These plans have to address statewide goals, including things like ensuring meaningful citizen involvement, establishing urban growth boundaries to minimize sprawl and protect farmland, planning for affordable housing, and ensuring adequate infrastructure like roads and sewers before development occurs. This system has faced many challenges over the decades, but it has survived and significantly reshaped how development happens in Oregon, preventing the kind of unchecked sprawl seen in many other states. It shows that long-term state-level commitment can work.
Okay. So technology, insecurity, environmental battles. What's another major theme of this recent era?
Economic and social inequality. This is a huge one.
We've definitely seen throughout history how inequality can be a powerful driver of change in government's role. You think back to the conditions that led to the progressive era reforms like the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, sparking workplace safety regulations.
Right. Or the Great Depression prompting massive federal job programs under the New Deal.
Or the poverty and civil rights struggles of the 1960s, leading to the Great Society's economic opportunity initiatives. It seems inequality is a recurring catalyst.
It certainly is. And now, in the 21st century, it has become strikingly evident, backed by lots of data, that economic inequality is increasing again and at a rapid pace. We're seeing concentrations of wealth at the very top that are reaching levels similar to the Gilded Age back in the late 19th century.
That's a pretty stark comparison.
It is. By the second decade of this century, this situation was widely recognized and had become a common, often heated topic in political discussion. The United States is now generally considered the most unequal of the economically advanced countries. One study cited in the text from 2014 claimed a staggering 75.4% of all wealth owned by the richest 10% of the people.
Wow, three-quarters of the wealth held by the top tenth.
And on a global scale, the concentration is even more extreme. Another report around the same time found that just 8 people, owned as much wealth as the bottom half of the entire world's population.
8 people versus billions.
Yeah.
That's hard to even comprehend.
It's truly mind-boggling. Now, naturally, there's significant disagreement about whether this extreme level of inequality is a fundamental social problem that needs addressing, or if it's simply a natural, maybe even efficient outcome of the modern global economy.
Different perspectives on whether it's a problem or just how things are.
Exactly. But regardless of the cause or whether it's inherently bad, great inequality can undeniably generate significant public discontent. We see that playing out politically. Politicians often find this discontent useful in supporting their election campaigns, tapping into feelings of unfairness or being left behind. But widespread discontent can also lead to electoral defeats for incumbents and pressure for administrative change.
And beyond the politics.
Beyond the politics, there's a profound moral question, isn't there? About the appropriateness of such extreme inequality existing within a society that calls itself a modern democracy. And crucially for our focus, public policies have far-reaching effects on inequality, either mitigating it or exacerbating it.
How so?
Well, think back again. During the Progressive Era, the New Deal, and the Great Society, many actions taken by political and administrative leaders were explicitly designed to help increase the economic well-being of poor and working-class people, thereby mitigating existing inequality. Think minimum wage, Social Security, Medicare, anti-poverty programs. In contrast, periods of reaction against those policies like the 1980s and parts of the current era often feature initiatives that tend to increase inequality. Things like cutting taxes disproportionately for upper-income individuals and corporations, reducing or eliminating the estate tax, which limits the intergenerational transfer of large fortunes, and weakening social safety net programs for the elderly, poor, and disabled.
So policy choices directly impact the level of inequality.
Absolutely. The implication for public administration in the daily work is clear. Social equity becomes incredibly important. That means ensuring fair and equitable treatment and access to services for all individuals, regardless of their race, gender, economic status, or other personal characteristics. It becomes a critical factor in how public services are designed and delivered. Public professionals may increasingly feel the need, or choose, to use social equity as a key criterion, a guiding value, in their program design and implementation decisions.
Okay. That leads us nicely into another major theme, which feels very connected to inequality and discontent. The polarization of perspectives. Now, American history is certainly no stranger to serious political polarization. I mean, you had the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists right at the beginning.
There's debates there.
The Civil War, obviously the ultimate polarization. The Gilded Age labor conflicts were incredibly violent and divisive. The Vietnam War tore the country apart. So polarization isn't new. What makes this current era different?
That's an excellent question because you're right. Polarization itself isn't new, but its character and intensity can shift. During most of what this chapter treats as the current era, say from the 1980s up through the early 2000s, political polarization typically took the form of, let's call it, traditional policy disagreement between conservatives and progressives. There were sharp differences, yes, but there was often still some effort made, or at least an expectation of effort, to cooperate on certain issues, to find common ground, to compromise.
Okay. Disagreement, but maybe within shared boundaries.
Perhaps. But most recently, particularly in the last decade or so, the political system, especially at the national level, has become so intensely polarized that competing views often seem simply irreconcilable. This makes it incredibly difficult to create relatively stable, long-lasting policies and programs. Everything feels temporary, subject to being overturned after the next election.
Like policy whiplash.
Exactly. The political right and left now hold deeply conflicting, almost mutually exclusive preferences on a huge array of fundamental issues. Things like the basic size and scope of government, levels and types of taxation, how immigrants should be treated, government's role in environmental protection, the rights of minorities and women. The list goes on. There's very little common ground on the big questions.
And this polarization isn't just political, is it? It seems cultural, too.
Very much so. The distinctions between so-called red states and blue states have grown much sharper. It suggests the nation is increasingly dividing into distinct conservative and liberal political and cultural enclaves. Conservative areas are often found more in rural regions and places heavily affected by the decline of traditional industries, the transition from an industrial to a technological economy. Liberal enclaves tend to be centered on major urban areas and parts of the two coasts. And these divisions extend beyond just voting patterns. They often correlate with favored news outlets, entertainment preferences, lifestyle choices, even fundamental religious and moral views. People seem to be living in different realities.
Different realities. That sounds like it connects to another alarming development you mentioned earlier.
It does. A particularly disturbing trend related to this polarization is what appears to be a step backward in the capacity of a significant portion of the citizenry to understand and form rational judgments about public issues based on shared facts.
You mean like disinformation and misinformation?
Precisely. While, of course, some percentage of the population has always been uninformed or held quirky beliefs, this tendency seems to be growing and becoming more mainstream to an extent few would have predicted for the 21st century. The widespread use of social media, algorithms that create filter bubbles, and deliberate political attacks on fact-based journalism and scientific institutions have fostered a segment of the public that holds, well, alternative perspectives on reality. They don't agree on basic facts.
Can you give some examples from the text?
Sure. One striking example relates to the birther movement, the false claim that President Barack Obama wasn't born in the United States. A poll taken as late as 2016, near the end of his second term, revealed that an astonishing 72% of registered Republican voters still doubted that President Obama was born in the United States. That compared with only 20% of Democrats holding that a doubt. It's a stark finding about the persistence of a completely debunked story, deeply divided along partisan lines.
72%. That's shocking.
It is. Another disturbing example mentioned is the utterly false belief that the horrific mass murder of children and educators at Sandy Hook Elementary School in 2012 was somehow staged, faked by actors as part of a plot by Democrats supporting gun control. This bizarre and cruel belief actually led to real-world harassment of the grieving parents who lost their children, including disturbing online postings and even direct physical confrontations.
That's just awful. So what's the implication of this breakdown in shared reality for public administration?
The implication is profound and deeply worrying. People who cannot reliably distinguish factual information from false stories are, frankly, easily manipulated. The potential result is that public decision-making, the policies we adopt, the resources we allocate, becomes largely disconnected from on-the-ground reality, based instead on misinformation or conspiracy theories. And this directly impacts the day-to-day work of public administration. Imagine public meetings of city councils, county commissions, school boards, or state legislative sessions.
Yeah.
Where you might have members of the public, or even some elected officials themselves, who hold beliefs about the issue at hand that are demonstrably factually false. How can you have a rational decision-making process about crucial matters like the cost-effectiveness of different programs, or the findings of environmental science, or the real-world impacts of public actions on vulnerable people if the deliberation is severely flawed by being based on non-factual beliefs?
It makes evidence-based policy almost impossible in some cases.
It makes it incredibly difficult, yes. It challenges the very foundation of rational public discourse and administration.
Okay. This leads us to the final major trend or theme discussed for this era: the issues around racism, nativism, and anti-feminism. Now, as the text points out, these issues, race discrimination, nativism, that fear of people unlike the majority, and anti-feminism, they've unfortunately been evident throughout American history, not just in the current era.
That's absolutely right. These are sadly persistent threads. But for much of the period we're calling the current era, say the 1980s through the 2000s, there was a general sense, or perhaps a hope, that progress was being made.
Progress towards what?
Towards greater equality, towards more tolerance of difference, towards stronger legal recognition of rights for marginalized groups. Think about examples like the eventual ending of discrimination against gays, serving openly in the military, ongoing efforts to ensure full voting rights for minorities were protected, legal protections for women's reproductive choices established by Roe v. Wade.
Okay, so a feeling that things were moving, albeit slowly, in the right direction.
Yes, that was the prevailing narrative for many. And public administration scholarship during this time also reflected this, encouraging more open discussion about race and the role of women in the public sector. Researchers like Susan Gooden, in her 2014 book Race and Social Equity, A nervous area of government argued that actually making progress on racial disparities depends on openly acknowledging these difficult issues, citing positive examples from places like Seattle and Wisconsin. Others, like Muhammad Al-Qudri and Leslie Tower in Women in Public Service, documented the status of women in public agencies, emphasizing that achieving proper representation isn't just the right thing to do ethically, but also critical for the success of policy implementation. Diverse perspectives lead to better policy.
So both scholarly attention and some real-world legal and social changes suggested progress.
It seemed that way. During the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, there appeared to be a long-term trend towards a society that was becoming gradually less overtly inclined toward racism, nativism, and anti-feminist sentiment. Now, crucially, this doesn't mean those attitudes disappeared. They were always present, simmering beneath the surface.
Right, not gone, but maybe less acceptable in the mainstream.
Exactly. They appeared partially suppressed, perhaps by majority public opinion and the stances of mainstream political leadership at the time, but they were still visible, manifesting in persistent issues like disparities in policing and police violence against minorities, the dramatic rise in incarceration rates disproportionately affecting Black and Hispanic populations, ongoing initiatives in some states to limit minority voting access, increasing restrictions on women's ability to make reproductive choices, political resistance to gay marriage and allowing guys to serve openly in the military, and fierce opposition to providing universal health care. So the undercurrents were strong.
But the most recent part of this era suggests that suppression was temporary.
That's what the evidence strongly suggests, yes. In the most recent decade or so, events indicate that the partial suppression of these views was, unfortunately, only temporary. These attitudes, overt racism, nativism, anti-feminism, and related sentiments have demonstrably moved back into the political mainstream at both national and state levels. And they are actively influencing public policy, again, in very direct ways.
Can you give some examples?
Well, think about the rise in negative public rhetoric and policy proposals targeting immigrants and refugees, particularly those fleeing war and violence. Think about the expansion of actions at the state level limiting access to voting, which often disproportionately affect minority communities, or the rollback of reproductive rights for women following the overturning of Roe v. Wade. An especially disturbing recent situation highlighted in the text is the highly visible reemergence of openly white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups. Their members seem to feel emboldened, perhaps even supported by the national political environment in ways they haven't for decades.
Yeah, seeing images of those groups marching openly is chilling.
It is. The text notes that not since the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s have images of, frankly, hate-filled screaming people chanting racist slogans been so prominent again in the national media. And importantly, this isn't just a national-level political phenomenon happening far away. It directly affects people in local communities. It impacts law enforcement professionals dealing with hate groups, managers of public facilities targeted by them, and members of minority groups who feel less safe.
So what are the implications for public administration now?
Well, these developments have prompted significant pushback and mobilization from people nationwide who reject these views. It sparked renewed activism and public debate. It seems highly likely that public discussion and political action on these issues of race, equality, and tolerance will have profound and lasting effects on both the study and the practice of public administration for the foreseeable future. It serves as a stark, painful reminder that complacency towards bigotry and discrimination is never appropriate. These are ongoing struggles.
Wow. Okay, so after covering those major, often challenging trends, technology, insecurity, inequality, polarization, and the resurgence of these divisivisms, let's try to synthesize. What does this all mean for how public administration actually operates day to day in this current era? The chapter highlights two key features, right?
Yes, it pulls things together by looking at two prominent features. First, the evolution of what it calls citizen-oriented governance, and second, the increasingly complex and challenging role of the public professional.
Okay, let's start with citizen-oriented governance. We touched on citizen participation earlier with NPG. How has that evolved?
Well, following the groundbreaking use of citizen participation in some of those great society programs back in the 60s, involving the public directly in policymaking and implementation became a much more frequently used technique across the public sector.
So it wasn't just a fad.
No, it's stuck around and spread. This is especially true at the local level of government, where you have elected governing bodies like city councils or school boards, but also much greater opportunity for direct public participation in meetings, workshops, advisory committees, etc. Inspired by the social changes during and after the Great Society years, many local governments actually formalized citizen participation or citizen involvement as a continuous, expected, and important part of how they make policy and implement programs. It became standard practice in many places.
Can you give some concrete examples of what that looks like?
Sure. The text mentions a study by Barry, Portney, and Thompson from 1993, The Rebirth of Urban Democracy. They described successful neighborhood-based citizen involvement programs in 5 different cities back in the 1980s. Birmingham, Alabama, Dayton, Ohio, Portland, Oregon, St. Paul, Minnesota, and San Antonio, Texas.
What did they find? Did these programs actually work?
They found that these neighborhood citizen groups, often formally recognized by the city, had considerable influence over city decision-making on local issues that affected their specific areas, things like zoning changes, park improvements, traffic management. And just as importantly, they found that participation fostered an enhanced sense of community belonging among residents and seemed to increase their trust in local government.
So real impact and improved relationships. What about a more recent example?
A large-scale contemporary example highlighted is the neighborhood council system in Los Angeles. An effort to create formally recognized neighborhood organizations citywide began there in 1999. By 2004, these neighborhood groups were being officially certified by the city's Department of Neighborhood Empowerment. By 2017, there were 96 such neighborhood councils across LA, a huge city of 4 million people. And their members actively work with city departments on a really diverse range of issues like crime, roads and streets, gangs, and the economy. It's a significant structure for grassroots engagement.
96 neighborhood councils. That sounds like a lot of different people and organizations involved in governing. It's definitely not just the government acting alone anymore.
Exactly. And that leads to the concept of governance that we discussed with MPG. The contemporary policy making and implementation setting usually involves multiple organizational and individual participants working together, often in complex networks, through some kind of deliberative process.
Who are these participants typically?
It's a wide mix. You can have elected officials, often from more than one jurisdiction, like city and county, working together. You have members of appointed boards or committees. You have citizens volunteering their time on specific issues they care about. You have professional staff from various public agencies, potentially at different levels of government, federal, state, local, all involved in one project. And increasingly, you have representatives from relevant nonprofit organizations and private businesses involved as partners or stakeholders.
That sounds potentially messy. Lots of cooks in the kitchen.
Chuckles. It can be complex to manage, absolutely. Researchers Kaliba, Meek, and Zia developed a helpful way to categorize these governance network participants into 3 broad types. They talked about democratic participants, that's elected officials, ordinary citizens, maybe the courts, then administrative participants, principal administrators, technical experts, professional staff, collaborators from other agencies, and finally, market participants, owners, consumers, representatives from private businesses or industry groups. Navigating this complex network environment, balancing all these different interests and perspectives, inherently requires considerable management skill, facilitation skill on the part of the public professional. It's a core competency now.
In John Clayton Thomas, his framework you mentioned earlier helps us understand the different roles we as individuals can play when interacting with government in this governance context, right?
Yeah. Yes, it's a very useful distinction for thinking about our own engagement. He distinguished 3 potential roles the public can take. We might be customers, simply asking for a specific routine service like getting our garbage picked up or a pothole filled. We might be partners, actively working with government to achieve a shared goal, for example, sorting our recyclables properly to help the city's recycling program succeed. Or, and this is often the most demanding but potentially most impactful role, we might be citizens, engaging in deliberation with government to determine what services should be offered in the first place and how they should fundamentally be delivered, like participating in community meetings to decide whether and how to implement a new composting program.
Customer, partner, citizen. Different levels of engagement.
Different levels, different expectations, different responsibilities.
Now, this deliberative process involving citizens, interest groups, multiple organizations, it sounds great in theory, promoting democracy and all that. But you mentioned it can be time-consuming and costly. Are there downsides?
Oh, definitely. While embracing public involvement is often seen as positive, agencies need to approach it with careful consideration. Irvine and Stansbury evaluated the pros and cons specifically from the agency's perspective.
What did they find were the advantages for the agency?
They identified several key advantages. First, it's a great way for the agency to learn about citizens' real perceptions of problems and needs, and to share the agency's own information and constraints in return. Builds mutual understanding. Second, it provides an invaluable opportunity to potentially persuade the public to support a necessary policy or program, building buy-in. And third, it can give citizens a crucial sense of empowerment and ownership over decisions that affect them, which can lead to more legitimacy and trust.
Okay, those sound like solid benefits. What about the disadvantages?
They highlighted several significant ones, too. First, the sheer investment of time and resources required to do participation well, organizing meetings, preparing materials, analyzing input can be substantial. Second, there's the inherent difficulty of attracting a representative sample of residents to spend substantial time and effort engaging in a deliberative process, especially for complex or non-controversial issues. Turnout can be low and skewed.
Yeah, getting people to show up to meetings is tough.
It really is. Third, there's the common problem of overrepresentation by specific organized interests, maybe other government agencies, businesses with a stake, well-funded special interest nonprofits, while ordinary citizens or less organized groups get drowned out. And finally, there's the persistent challenge of self-interest among participants. Despite the ideal of people acting out of concern for the common good, often participants are there primarily to protect or advance their own narrow interests.
So participation isn't a magic bullet.
Far from it. And it's crucial to acknowledge that many public policy issues and programs, especially highly technical matters that aren't of broad interest to the general public, probably wouldn't benefit much from a wide-open, participatory, deliberative process. It might just slow things down unnecessarily. Even with issues that might draw public interest, the commitment of time and resources needed to properly organize and staff a meaningful participation effort might simply outweigh the potential advantages for the agency and the outcome.
So it needs to be used strategically.
Exactly. It's a tool, not a panacea. Nevertheless, the chapter concludes that where they do fit the circumstances, well-designed deliberative processes can yield outcomes that better align with on-the-ground conditions and are more sustainable over the long term because they have broader buy-in. They can also foster that stronger sense of community, create a more informed local public about important issues, and ultimately build a better, more trusting relationship between a public agency and the people it serves.
Okay. That covers citizen-oriented governance. What about the second key feature? The public professional navigating this challenging time. Given everything we've discussed, this complex tapestry of conflicting private versus public interests, the fuzzy boundaries between sectors, the hyperpolarized political environment, the public's uncertainty about basic facts, what does it even mean to be a public professional today? It sounds incredibly difficult.
It truly is a profoundly challenging time for professionalism in the public sector. There's this deep-seated cultural expectation in the United States, as we've discussed, that public employees should be politically neutral implementers of laws passed by elected officials.
Right, the old politics administration dichotomy. Politicians decide, administrators implement.
Exactly. That model is still very powerful in the public imagination. However, it has long been recognized by scholars and practitioners alike that this view doesn't accurately reflect the complex realities of administrative work for many, probably most, public professionals today.
Why not? How does reality differ?
Well, while constitutions and laws provide the general framework and boundaries, they often leave a substantial amount of discretion, interpretation, prioritization, resource allocation to be decided by public professionals in the course of their daily work. Policy is rarely perfectly clear or comprehensive. Furthermore, especially at the state and local levels, research has shown that a large portion of actual innovations in policy and programs, new ideas, better ways of doing things, often originate from public professionals themselves who see problems and opportunities up close. Often they develop these ideas working together with supportive elected officials.
So they're not just passive implementers, they're active participants in shaping policy.
In many cases, yes. While some jobs in the public sector do involve very straightforward implementation of detailed rules with little public contact, maybe processing routine forms aligning closely with that dichotomy model, many other public professionals' daily work demands that they exercise independent judgment constantly within the bounds of existing law and policy. This involves sensing what the public wants or needs, diagnosing problems based on their expertise, and actively choosing among possible courses of action.
Can you give an example of that kind of independent judgment?
Sure, think about a police chief who, responding to community concerns about racial bias in policing and maybe specific controversial incidents, decides to proactively create a citizens review panel to evaluate those incidents and recommend changes to policy or training. That's not likely something mandated by law. It's the chief using their professional judgment and authority to address a perceived public need and build trust, operating within their legal authority but definitely shaping policy implementation.
Okay, so public professionals often actively participate in the policy process because they're the ones directly in contact with the messy on-the-ground conditions. They have the education, the training, the experience to propose and implement potentially effective actions.
Exactly.
Yet when they exhibit this kind of leadership, this initiative, they might be perceived by some as acting outside their appropriate role, right? Because they aren't elected officials directly accountable to the voters' will. That's a real tightrope to walk.
It's a huge tension, a real tightrope, as you say, especially when administrative decisions, even if well-intentioned and evidence-based, lead to visible, significant impacts on programs or services or challenge powerful interests. Their legitimacy may be questioned. They might be accused of being unelected bureaucrats overstepping their bounds.
So how do they navigate that? How do they justify their actions?
It's crucial to remember, as the chapter emphasizes, that public professionals don't operate in a vacuum. They use values and concepts derived from their professional training, their fields of expertise, to guide their actions. Their work is not value-free, nor should it necessarily be.
What kind of professional values are we talking about?
It depends heavily on their specific disciplinary training and field. These values might include things like economic efficiency and sustainability for a budget analyst, or aesthetic community design and smart growth for a city planner, or social justice and equity for a social worker, protection of endangered wildlife for a biologist, prevention of violence against women for someone in law enforcement or victim services, ensuring high-quality infrastructure construction for an engineer, upholding merit principles in personnel administration for an HR manager, or promoting affordable housing for a housing agency official.
Yeah.
These are all legitimate professional values.
Okay. But how do these professional values fit with the expectation of neutrality or responsiveness to elected officials?
The key is that these professional values don't necessarily violate public expectations of their roles as long as professionals operate within the limits of existing laws and policies. Their role often involves recommending changes to laws and policies based on their expertise and values, working through the political process, rather than trying to unilaterally impose their views in defiance of the law or clear political direction.
So working within the system, using expertise to inform, not dictate.
Exactly. And a large body of research that's developed since the Great Society era portrays this not as a simple dichotomy, but as a continuum of public professional roles. At one end of the continuum, you have the neutral implementer. This is primarily a technical role where the expressed policy preferences of the elected governing body are carried out with as little independent application of professional values as possible. Just follow the rules precisely. At the other end of the continuum, you have the expert professional. This is a role where action is guided much more significantly by professional values, specialized knowledge, and a rational assessment of the on-the-ground conditions.
But both roles operate within the law.
Yes, that's critical. Both roles comply with existing laws and policies. The key difference lies in the expert professional's greater willingness, maybe even perceived obligation, to use their specialized knowledge and judgment to adapt policy and programs to the complex, messy realities of running public services effectively and ethically. Most people working in public agencies probably fall somewhere between these two poles in their general orientation to their work, and they might shift along that continuum depending on the specific issue they're dealing with.
So it's not a fixed identity, but a flexible approach.
Very much so. These concepts might seem abstract, but they become very concrete in the daily work of, say, a state wildlife biologist deciding how to manage a species, or a city police captain allocating patrol resources, or a regional utility system engineer planning infrastructure upgrades, or a county land use planner reviewing a development proposal, or a contracts manager overseeing a huge Department of Defense project. In these and countless other public service occupations, individuals routinely make decisions about how to prioritize their professional knowledge versus information and pressure gained from others in that governance network, politicians, citizens, interest groups. And in the contemporary political setting, with all the polarization and mistrust we've discussed, we can expect public professionals to be under increasing pressure to take into account a wider variety of views in their work. Sometimes their role might require them to actively facilitate a search for consensus or compromise among perspectives that are really difficult to reconcile.
Wow. So the job is getting harder, more complex, demanding not just technical skill, but sophisticated political and ethical judgment too.
Absolutely. It's an incredibly demanding role in the 21st century.
Okay, this brings us towards the end of our historical exploration, moving from the past right up to the present challenges. This chapter really serves as that crucial bridge, showing how our review of those earlier eras, founding, progressive, New Deal, Great Society, directly connects to the complexities of today.
Indeed. And the core premise of the whole book, Essential History, as we've said, is that understanding this historical and cultural context of public administration, the political and economic environment it operates within, is profoundly useful, maybe even essential, for contemporary public service professionals. The book focused on those four earlier eras of dramatic change to illuminate how each one contributed layers to shaping the federal, state, and local governments we interact with today. So this review of the current era really sets the stage for thinking about how those past impacts continue to resonate now and how they might influence the future of public administration.
And the book identifies four recurring themes that run through all these eras, right?
Mhm.
As a way to organize our thinking about these connections.
Exactly. Four themes common to all the earlier eras that are particularly useful for pulling this all together. First, public versus private interest. Second, concentrated wealth and power. Third, the size and cost of government. And fourth, insiders versus outsiders.
Okay, those sound like themes that are definitely still relevant today.
Incredibly so. When we think about these themes, tracing them from the founding era right up to the present, it becomes strikingly clear that the core issues, the fundamental tensions in government and society, remain remarkably consistent over time. Even as the surface details technology, the physical landscape, media, lifestyles have changed almost beyond recognition, these underlying conflicts endure.
Fascinating. Okay, let's quickly see how these four enduring themes play out specifically in our current era, based on everything we've just discussed. First, public versus private interest.
This tension is arguably of primary importance to the entire story of changing government roles that the book tells. The very concept of public interest assumes that the citizenry, collectively, wants to act to change existing conditions in society for the common good. That collective action is precisely what the public sector is for. Yet, as we've seen throughout American history, Americans have always been deeply ambivalent about just how much collective capacity to act, how much government power they truly think is appropriate or safe.
Constant push and pull.
A constant push and pull. Think back. In the founding era, Federalists wanted a stronger, more active national government than the Articles of Confederation provided, while Anti-Federalists deeply feared a powerful, centralized government potentially trampling on liberties. Even the Federalists built in checks and balances, showing an inherent mistrust alongside the desire for effectiveness. During the Progressive Era, the previously limited role of government proved inadequate for addressing the huge challenges posed by giant new corporations, new forms of industrial work, and monopolistic economic practices. The definition of public interest had to expand to include controlling things like child labor, unsafe food, and damaging resource exploitation. And this expansion was fiercely resisted by powerful private interests. The New Deal in the 1930s saw a further massive expansion of the public interest concept, involving fine-grained intervention in the banking system, the creation of huge public jobs programs, and the foundational beginnings of unprecedented social insurance benefits protecting the elderly, like Social Security. For many conservatives at the time, this growth felt like it verged on socialism. And much the same can be said of the Great Society in the 1960s, which broadly expanded the social safety net started during the New Deal, alongside landmark new federal regulations for air and water quality, workplace safety conditions, and protecting minority rights. Again, huge resistance.
Okay, so that's the historical pattern. How does this public versus private interest tension manifest in the current era we've been discussing? Has the balance shifted decisively one way?
Well, as we discussed with Schlester's observations, the balance in the current era has not shifted dramatically towards a sustained period of public purpose like those earlier eras. Instead, it seems to move back and forth more fluidly, more incrementally, largely depending on immediate public policy preferences, economic conditions, and which political ideology happens to be dominant nationally at any given moment. Financial regulation is a perfect example of this seesaw. Regulations tend to tighten after loose oversight contributes to a financial crisis, like the 2008 meltdown. But then, as public memory fades and private financial interests lobby heavily for deregulation, arguing it stifles innovation.
The regulations get relaxed again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Potentially setting the stage for the next crisis. It's a cycle driven by shifting perceptions of public versus private interest.
So what's the practical lesson here for public professionals operating in this current environment?
I think the key lesson is that, in the current era, the public generally seems to want to keep the government services and protections they've come to expect and rely on. People like Social Security, Medicare, clean air, safe roads. But new policy and program initiatives, especially those that expand government's role in regulating private activity or significantly increase spending, often encounter considerable resistance and skepticism. A very strong demonstration of clear public interest, a compelling case for collective action, is frequently needed now to overcome doubts about further expanding government's role. Furthermore, that pervasive skepticism about government we talked about, combined with the trends toward political polarization and the spread of misinformation. All this makes the work of public professionals exceptionally challenging. They're trying to maintain professional standards of practice, manage decision-making processes effectively, and serve the public interest in a really difficult environment. Where feasible, maybe building those cooperative, cross-sectoral working relationships that actively include public outreach and deliberation can help bridge that potential divide between public and private interests.
Okay. Second enduring theme, concentrated wealth and power.
This has been a recurring concern from the very beginning of the nation, hasn't it? Many in the founding era viewed the creation of the new Constitution itself partly as an attempt by the economic elite, the wealthy merchants and planters, to consolidate their power over indebted farmers and artisans.
Right, leading to things like Shays' Rebellion.
Exactly. Shays' Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, these vividly illustrate how ordinary people back then viewed those with wealth and power, often seeing them in opposition, particularly banks, merchants, and the courts enforcing debts. Fast forward to the Progressive Era, a central concern for leaders like Theodore Roosevelt was the immense concentration of wealth and political power held by a tiny number of businessmen, the robber barons, leading huge monopolistic companies in vital industries like finance, railroads, steel, and oil. In that era, and again during the New Deal and the Great Society, reformers sometimes had to collaborate with wealthy interests, but often they had to push forcefully against them to achieve goals like trust busting, labor rights, or environmental protection.
So how does this play out in the recent era?
Well, as we discussed, money has become a major, arguably overwhelming influence in national and state politics today. Wealthy individual donors, corporations, and various organized groups pour enormous resources into elections, which have become incredibly expensive to compete in. Simultaneously, the degree of economic inequality in the United States has reached levels not seen since the Gilded Age. Corporate executives are now paid colossal salaries, often hundreds of times more than their average workers, amounts unheard of just a few decades ago, while the incomes of ordinary working people have stagnated or grown very little in real terms over that same period.
And the policy connection.
Meanwhile, there is constant political pressure, particularly from conservative groups and politicians, to cut government programs that benefit lower and middle income people and simultaneously reduce taxes, especially for the wealthy and corporations. Increasingly, public perceptions of being left behind, of being excluded from the benefits of global economic growth, appear to be driving both electoral results and policy discussions about contentious issues like international trade agreements, tax policy, and the regulation or deregulation of private sector activities.
So what are the implications of this concentration of wealth and power for public professionals trying to do their jobs?
For the public professional working on the ground, this is an environment where sensitivity to citizens' economic concerns, to feelings of unfairness and inequality can be absolutely paramount to successful governance and maintaining public trust. And that concept of social equity we mentioned, the idea that government should treat people fairly and equitably, regardless of their economic status or other personal characteristics, becomes especially relevant and critically important today. It needs to be a conscious consideration.
Okay. Third theme. The size and cost of government. This one feels like it's always there.
Always. Concern, or maybe just grumbling, about the size and cost of government has been an enduring part of American political culture since the founding era. Anti-federalists worried about it constantly.
It seems like the default setting is skepticism about government spending.
It often is. Aside from times of major war, this traditional anxiety about government size and costs has only really been suppressed during a few brief periods in history, allowing the public sector to expand significantly to meet major societal challenges. Objections to new programs and expenditures were sort of temporarily pushed into the background during parts of the New Deal and the Great Society when crises demanded action. But those objections quickly regained influence in the later phases of both those periods and certainly afterwards.
So advocating for smaller, less costly government is often politically popular.
It's often an attractive message for political leaders, yes, but actually putting it into practice, making significant cuts, proves very difficult. Why? Because citizens, over time, have grown accustomed to and often rely heavily on the programs, regulations, and protections that were enacted during those earlier eras of change. So, although voters may respond positively to anti-government campaign rhetoric in the abstract, they are generally not in favor of serious cuts when it comes to specific essential services they personally benefit from or value, like Social Security, roads, schools, environmental protection.
The keep your government hands off my Medicare phenomenon.
Exactly, that captures the ambivalence perfectly. At the same time, as we discussed, the public generally does not appear to want another era of significant, sudden expansion in the role of government either. They seem wary of big, new programs.
So kind of a stalemate. Keep what we have, but don't add much.
Sort of. Reform efforts aimed at efficiency, like the Clinton administration's National Performance Review, NPR, have certainly helped to contain the growth in the size of the federal government workforce. However, the federal government is just so massive, its budget so complex, that achieving meaningful oversight of all agency expenditures, all the contracted services, the thousands of programs, it remains an incredibly daunting task for Congress and the public. State and local governments, which typically cannot run large operating deficits year after year like the federal government can, often offer more immediate opportunities for citizen oversight and demands for fiscal accountability. Things are closer to home.
So the bottom line for public professionals on this theme.
Across all levels of government, citizens demand fiscal accountability. They want value for their tax dollars. This means there will be continuing, probably intensifying, pressure on public professionals for efficiency, for transparent performance measurement showing results, and for robust justification of all new expenditures. You have to make the case for why something is needed and effective.
Okay. Final enduring theme. Insiders versus outsiders. This touches on the issues of discrimination and tolerance we discussed earlier.
Yes, it directly relates. And it's striking, as the text notes, how present attitudes about acceptance, tolerance, and the celebration of differences between people are not at all what many people might have expected or hoped for several decades ago. The nation has gone through these long, shameful periods of abusive behavior toward various minority groups: Native Americans, African Americans, immigrants from different waves, religious minorities, LGBTQ+ individuals. At the beginning of the 21st century, maybe around the year 2000, it seemed to many observers that those societal impulses toward discrimination, denial of rights, and disapproval of difference were genuinely weakening. Or at least they were becoming less visible and less acceptable in mainstream public affairs.
Right, that sense of progress again.
Exactly. There was a sense of progress supported by examples like ending Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the military, the passage and enforcement of voting rights legislation, the legal protection of women's reproductive choices under Roe. And as we mentioned, public administration scholarship was also encouraging more open discussion on race, gender, and equity, arguing for the ethical and practical importance of diversity and inclusion in public service.
So for a while, 80s, 90s, 2000s, it looked like a positive trend.
It seemed to be a long-term trend towards a society less overtly driven by racism, nativism, and anti-feminist sentiment. Again, these attitudes were still present, absolutely, but they appeared partially suppressed, pushed somewhat to the margins by majority public opinion and mainstream political leadership. You could still see them, though, in persistent problems like police violence against minorities, the rising tide of mass incarceration, subtle and not so subtle initiatives to limit minority voting access, ongoing efforts to restrict reproductive choices, resistance to gay marriage, and opposition to universal health care, which often had racial or nativist undertones.
But then, more recently, that suppression seemed to lift.
That's what events in the most recent part of the current era strongly suggest, that the partial suppression was only temporary. These attitudes and related public sentiments have moved back into the political mainstream at both national and state levels. They are openly influencing public policy again. We see it in negative public views and policies toward immigrants and refugees. We see it in the expansion of actions limiting access to voting or women's health care. And as mentioned before, the especially disturbing recent situation is the highly visible emergence of white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups whose members seem to feel emboldened by the national political environment. Not since the civil rights struggles of the 50s and 60s have these images been so prominent.
So what are the implications of this resurgence for public administration?
Well, first, it's a reminder that this isn't just a national political issue. It directly affects people and public servants in local communities, law enforcement, school officials, library managers, everyone. While it would obviously be beneficial for the nation if this trend were to fade with a shift towards a national politics that explicitly rejects and does not seek the support of these hate groups, its future development remains uncertain. But even if it doesn't become more serious than it already is, it has served as a stark reminder that complacency toward bigotry is never appropriate. These issues require constant vigilance and pushback. And the pushback is happening nationwide. It seems very likely that public discussion and political action around these inside-outsider issues will have important and lasting effects on both the study and the practice of public administration for the foreseeable future. Issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion are moving even more to the forefront.
Wow. Okay, what an incredible and frankly sometimes sobering deep dive into the complex current era of public administration. We've traced its roots from that declining trust back in the 70s,
Right, through the government as problem ethos of the 80s.
the running government like a business focus of the 90s.
And into the really layered complexities of the 2000s and beyond, with technology, insecurity, inequality, intense polarization, and these resurgent social divisions.
We've truly seen a fascinating paradox unfold, haven't we? A society that seems deeply skeptical of government overreach, constantly worried about its size and cost.
Yet at the same time, a society that simultaneously expects government to provide almost everything, from basic order and essential services like roads and schools, to comprehensive protection against the vulnerabilities of modern life, old age, disease, poverty, economic downturns, natural disasters, even a degraded physical environment.
We want it all, but we don't want to pay for it or trust it too much.
It's a fundamental tension, maybe the fundamental tension that defines our current era in public administration.
So, for you, our listeners, as you reflect on this journey through Chapter 6 of your Essential History for Public Administration readings, maybe consider this provocative thought to wrap things up. In a world that seems defined by increasing complexity, incredibly rapid change, profound inequality, and these deeply polarized perspectives, how can public professionals, the people doing the actual work of government, truly embodies the principles of transparency, responsiveness, and integrity? How can they build, or maybe rebuild, public trust and ensure we have an effective, accountable public sector for the future?
And building on that, think about where you see opportunities for yourself to engage. Remember those roles Thomas described. Will you engage primarily as a customer, just seeking a service, or as a partner collaborating with government on a specific project? Or perhaps most critically in these challenging times, will you engage as a citizen, actively participating in deliberation about the very future of your community? How can you help navigate these enduring themes of public versus private interest, wealth and power, government cost, and insiders versus outsiders, and help shape the public purpose in your own unique way?